What's up guys, Neil Weaver here with another series of the Energy Academy. In previous series, I outlined the overall structure of Great Britain's electricity system and introduced the wholesale market at an extremely high level. In this series, I'll be delving into markets in more detail so that you can understand how businesses make money in Great Britain's electricity system. By the end of this series, you should understand the overall structure of Britain's major interlinking markets for electricity, how the capacity market works, what it is and how it helps decide which new generators actually get built, the nuts and bolts of the wholesale market, forward and futures, the timings of the intraday, the difference between physical and non-physical trading, and intraday and day-ahead trading. The balancing mechanism, which is the mechanism that the ESO uses to balance the system in real time. Imbalance pricing, or what happens when participants can't or don't do what they said they would. And finally, ancillary services, those smaller markets that ensure security of supply. As you can see, we've got absolutely loads to cover in this series, and that means loads of new concepts and jargon for you to wrap your head around. But fear not, I'll be taking you through all this stuff in a super logical order so that you understand not only how all those markets and mechanisms work, but also how they all fit together. In the next episode, I'll be outlining the main markets for electricity in Great Britain and the structure that they sit within. I'll see you there. Hi everyone, Neil again with another episode of the Energy Academy. Over the past couple of series, I've explained that the vast majority of electricity is traded on the wholesale market. True. And that generators in Great Britain are privately funded, developed and owned in accordance with market forces and government policy. Also true. However, it's a major oversimplification. The electricity market in Great Britain is actually not best thought of as a single entity. Instead, it's a series of interdependent markets and mechanisms which all have their own distinct roles and responsibilities. As I said before, National Grid ESO, our system operator, is still responsible for overseeing the balance of supply and demand. It's also directly responsible for the day-to-day running of some of these markets. Ofgem is still responsible for regulating these markets and ensuring that all participants play within each market's rules to ensure a level playing field. The electricity market itself is then made up of a number of other markets, mechanisms and services. First, we've got the capacity market. This works as a sort of insurance policy to ensure that Britain has enough capacity to keep the lights on. It does this by determining which new generators get built and which existing generators remain online. In that sense, you could say that the capacity market is responsible for determining the makeup of the generation stack in Great Britain. If the capacity market helps to determine the generation mix, the wholesale market is where generators decide when and how much electricity to generate based on the price per megawatt hour that they can get. As explained in Series 2, electricity can be traded on the wholesale market across massive time frames, from years ahead of schedule right up to 1 hour before the point of actual delivery. This time, 1 hour before delivery, is known as gate closure. Gate closure is when generators have to inform National Grid ESO of their intentions. It's then the ESO's job to make sure that planned supply and demand are balanced, and it does this primarily through the balancing mechanism. The balancing mechanism does what it says on the tin. It's a mechanism for balancing electricity. In the balancing mechanism, the ESO pays generators to increase or reduce the levels of electricity they had previously intended to provide. The ESO can also ask large industrial users of electricity to turn up or turn down their usage to increase or reduce demand. This allows National Grid ESO to ensure that supply and demand are balanced. And finally, ancillary services help to balance the system at an even more granular level. They do this by maintaining grid stability on a second-by-second basis throughout the day. In this series, I'll be diving into each stage of this process in more detail. We'll cover every step of the journey so that by the end of this series, you'll have a much fuller picture of how the market for electricity in Great Britain operates. To begin, in the next episode, I'll be covering the capacity market. I'll see you there. Hi everyone, Neil from Modo here, and in this episode of the Energy Academy, I'm going to be discussing the market that determines which new generators get built, the capacity market. To start off, the capacity market is essentially just an insurance policy against potential blackouts. It's a mechanism that should ensure that we always have enough electricity to meet demand. This is necessary as we become more reliant on intermittent technologies like wind and solar, and especially during times of severe system stresses like extreme cold snaps. In simple terms, the capacity market allows both existing and new build generators to compete for contracts at auction. These contracts are between 1 and 15 years long. They pay assets not for the electricity that they deliver, but for the availability to provide capacity at times of potential peak demand, usually in winter. Bidders must forecast how much revenue they can earn without a capacity market contract, and then bid into the capacity market at the desired price to top up that revenue to make their project feasible. If a generator wins a capacity market contract, it's paid to ensure that it can turn up generation at times of potential system stress events at just 4 hours notice. These 4-hour warnings are called capacity market notices. Those system stress events, when generators actually have to kick into gear and provide the capacity, are known as capacity market events. So far, there hasn't ever been a capacity market event in Great Britain, but there have been numerous capacity market notices issued. Unless there is a capacity market event, participating assets will just continue to operate as normal. The first capacity market auction took place in 2014. Each year there are 2 capacity market auctions called the T-4 and the T-1 auctions. The numbers here just refer to the amount of years ahead of schedule that the capacity is being obtained for. Therefore, the T-4 auction is for delivery 4 years later, and the T-1 auction is for delivery the following winter. So, the first T-4 auction that took place in 2014 was actually for delivery in the winter of 2018-2019. In every sense, the T-4 auction is the main capacity market auction. It has the longest contracts and the most volume. It's open to bidding from both new and existing generators. In the T-4 auction, new build generators are able to win 15-year contracts. For developers looking to build new generation projects in the next few years, this sort of revenue security makes those projects far more appealing to investors. In fact, quite often, being able to build the generator at all is reliant upon winning the capacity market contract. Because of this, you could say that the capacity market essentially determines the makeup of Great Britain's generation stack. If you don't know what I mean by the generation stack, please head back to Series 2 to get a fuller picture. Anyway, if capacity market contracts only went to one type of generator, our generation stack would be limited. Therefore, the aim is to encourage the development of a number of different dispatchable technologies. What does dispatchable mean? I just mean generators that can be turned on and off relatively easily, like battery energy storage, pumped hydro to additional power stations, nuclear, interconnectors, that sort of thing. Like I said, these types of generators often rely on capacity market contracts to fund their development. Non-dispatchable technologies like wind and solar have their own support schemes and subsidies. Anyway, all of the dispatchable technologies that can enter the capacity market are subject to what's called a D-rating factor. This D-rating factor is used to level the playing field between different types of assets. Essentially, the amount that an asset gets paid for participating is linked to the likelihood that they'll be able to reliably provide their contractually agreed capacity for a set period of time. Therefore, storage assets like batteries are derated based on their duration. This means that shorter duration storage assets are going to be paid less than, say, open cycle gas turbines, which can run indefinitely. To round out the picture, the T-1 auctions act as top-up auctions that take place just ahead of the delivery year. These T-1 auctions ensure that the ESO has got enough capacity to safely get us through the following winter. So, now you know how the capacity market works and why we say it helps to determine Great Britain's generation stack. It's time to explore how those generators make money. In the next episode, I'll explain how forward and futures markets work. These are the markets through which the vast majority of electricity is bought and sold. I'll see you there. What's up everyone, Neil again with another instalment of the Energy Academy. So, now we know how the generation mix or generation stack is determined, it's time to look at how those generators make money. Over 90% of electricity trades occur in advance of delivery between generators and suppliers on what's known as forward or futures markets. Forward and futures markets allow participants to contract a price today for electricity that will be delivered at some point in the future. These contracts come in all different shapes and sizes. But what's the point in contracting to sell electricity now that won't actually move through wires and cables for another, say, 2 years? Well, these contracts essentially reduce risk. Generators get the security of knowing that someone will buy their electricity, and suppliers have the security of knowing that they'll have some of the electricity they need to meet their customers' demands. And by locking in the price well ahead of delivery, generators and suppliers reduce their exposure to continually changing and often volatile spot market prices. But how do they actually work? Let's start by outlining the difference between forward and futures trades. These are often mixed up due to the similar nature and outcomes of the markets, but there are some important distinctions to be made. While both forward and futures include an agreement to deliver energy at some point in the future, they differ based on how standardized the contracts are. So, let's start with forward trades. These are the trades with less standardized contracts. A forward contract is simply a contract between two parties who agree to buy and sell electricity at an agreed price on a set date. As I mentioned in the previous series, this is sometimes referred to as over-the-counter trading. Once agreed, the price is locked in, so it doesn't matter how the price changes between agreement and delivery or what the price is on the day of delivery. Then, once the date arrives, the agreed volume of electricity is delivered for the pre-agreed price. This form of trading allows for the customization of certain contract terms, such as contract duration and delivery period. Let's set out an example. Here's what a forward contract might look like. The seller or generator agrees to deliver 100 megawatts of electricity 24/7 across the whole month of, say, September 2025. And is paid £200 per megawatt hour to do so by the buyer or supplier. This continuous generation of consistent capacity across 24 hours is known as baseload, but I'll go into that in more detail shortly. When September 2025 rolls around, the seller generates 100 megawatts of electricity at all times and is paid the agreed £200 per megawatt hour to do so. Alternatively, the seller may agree to deliver the energy at more specific, granular times. Instead of delivering baseload, i.e. the same amount of electricity across 24 hours, the seller may agree to deliver certain volumes at certain times. As an example, it may agree to deliver 100 megawatts during certain 4-hour periods and then 50 megawatts during others, and agree to different prices for both. Even though that's a gross oversimplification, that's essentially how forward trades work. But what do I mean by futures? Well, like forward contracts, futures trades are for electricity to be delivered at some point in the future. However, the contracts are more standardized and less flexible. That's because they're traded on an exchange. There are a variety of products that you can buy and sell on futures exchanges. For example, on the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, there are 2 futures products that can be traded in Great Britain. The first is UK-based electricity futures. This is electricity traded 24 hours a day, so baseload, 7 days a week. The other is UK peak electricity futures. This is electricity traded during peak hours from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m, Monday to Friday. In both cases, delivery is required across a full month and can be traded as far as 5 years in advance of delivery. Generally, the further in advance that something is traded, the longer the agreed delivery period. So, if you're trading 2 years in advance of delivery, you'll likely be trading base load across full months. But if you're trading 2 days ahead of delivery, you're more likely to be looking at more granular delivery periods, 4-hour windows known as ether blocks, or even just single hours. Anyway, all this talk of timing is probably getting a little confusing. With that in mind, now feels like a pretty good time to take a detour. In the next episode, I'll be outlining the timings of what's known as the ether day, so that you can get a better picture of the types of granularities that electricity is traded at. I'll see you there. Hello everyone, Neil Weaver here again with another episode of the Energy Academy. We're really starting to dive into the nuts and bolts of how electricity is traded in Great Britain. And in this episode, I'm going to be outlining the timings of what's known as the ether day. Ether stands for Electricity Forward Agreement. It's a system used to specify load profiles when trading electricity. But what do I mean by load profile? Load profile just refers to the volume of electricity generated or the amount of demand across a given time frame. So what does the ether day actually look like? Well, the first thing to note is that the ether day is split up into 6 4-hour blocks, known helpfully as ether blocks. Somewhat confusingly, the ether day actually begins at 11 p.m. the previous night. So, for example, ether block 1 on the 16th of September will actually run from 11 p.m. on the 15th of September until 3 a.m. on the 16th. Therefore, the ether day runs not from midnight to midnight, but from 11 p.m. until 11 p.m. On top of this, the day is split up into 48 half-hour settlement periods. But somewhat confusingly, these run from midnight to midnight, like a normal day. So, as the ether day and ether block 1 actually begins at 11 p.m, the first 2 settlement periods of ether block 1 are actually settlement periods 47 and 48 from the previous day. Settlement period 1 runs from midnight until 12:30 a.m. Then you've got the lesser spotted ether A and ether B blocks. For example, ether block 4 runs from 11 a.m. until 3 p.m, but that can be split in half into ether 4A from 11 a.m. till 1 p.m, and ether 4B from 1 p.m. till 3 p.m. As I mentioned in the last episode, electricity is usually traded for set chunks of time, and these are sometimes referred to as products. Each product can denote a group of ether blocks that are just chunked together. Baseload products run across all 6 ether blocks from 11 p.m. one day till 11 p.m. the next day, i.e. 24 hours of the same volume of electricity. Peak products run on weekdays only, from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. across ether blocks 3, 4 and 5. Off-peak products take in ethers 1, 2 and 6 on weekdays, so 7 p.m. until 7 a.m, and all 6 ether blocks on weekends. Then you've got daytime and overnight products. Daytime products run across ether blocks 3, 4, 5 and 6, so from 7 a.m. until 11 p.m, and overnight products take in ether blocks 1 and 2, so from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. These larger products, groups of ether blocks chunked together, are usually traded on forward or futures markets, i.e. in advance of delivery. When trading over the counter, though, these can be adapted. For example, someone may want to purchase power just to cover peak periods, so ether blocks 4 and 5. The smaller, more granular products, 4-hour ether blocks, 2-hour ether A or B blocks, single hours or even single half-hour settlement periods are typically traded nearer to real time in accordance with more up-to-date forecasts of demand. So there you have it, the ether day, ether blocks and some typical trading products. In the next episode, I'll be returning to forward and futures markets to look at them from another angle, the difference between physical and non-physical trading. I'll see you there. What's up, crew? Neil again, and welcome back to the Energy Academy. In this episode, I'll be taking a look at the forward market from a new angle, talking about the difference between physical and non-physical trading. As explained in the previous episode, forward trading just refers to contracts between two parties to buy and sell electricity at a set price on a future date. In a physical trade, the seller or generator agrees to sell power to the buyer or supplier in advance of delivery. The asset then generates the power when it should, as per the terms of the agreement. Let's first look at a physical trade. The buyer purchases 100 megawatts of electricity for delivery in Ether Block 5 in a month's time. The seller then delivers this as agreed. The electrons move along the cables and have been physically traded. As I mentioned before, a lot of the time these contracts are to reduce risk. However, sometimes businesses or traders enter into forward contracts speculatively. This might sound fancy, but it essentially just means making a bet on how the price will change. The idea here is to make money from that bet rather than wanting to buy or sell actual electricity. Since forwards are only paper contracts and not physical commodities, it means that businesses can trade the contracts without ever actually needing to deliver any electricity. When this happens, it's called non-physical trading. To help explain this better, I'll outline a couple of simple non-physical trading scenarios. In the first scenario, the trader buys an electricity forward contract and speculates or bets that the price of electricity will increase in the intervening period before delivery. In this example, the buyer purchases 100 megawatts of electricity for delivery across the evening peak, Ether Block 5, in a month's time. In this scenario, the trader is imitating a supplier. However, the buyer's not a supplier at all. It's a non-physical trader. The trader has no intention of actually supplying electricity to customers. As I said, they're expecting the price of electricity to increase closer to real time. So, let's say they buy that electricity at £50 per megawatt hour. If the electricity rises in the intervening period to, let's say, £75 a megawatt hour, the trader can then sell on that contract to an actual supplier who actually needs it to meet their customers' demands. The trader has made a profit, £25 per megawatt hour, without actually having to deliver any electricity to customers. Crucially, they need to sell this electricity before the time of delivery. Otherwise, they're obliged to actually buy the electricity from a generator. So, if the price instead goes down to £40 per megawatt hour, the trader still has to sell that contract. However, as they can only get £40 a megawatt hour for it, in this case the trader makes a loss of £10 per megawatt hour. Let's look at non-physical trading from another angle. In this scenario, the non-physical trader is imitating a generator, i.e. a seller of electricity. The trader enters into a contract to sell electricity to a supplier. Again, let's say 100 megawatts across Ether Block 5 in a month's time. This time, the contract is worth £100 per megawatt hour. In this scenario, the trader expects the price of electricity to fall in the intervening period before delivery. And let's say it does, to £75 per megawatt hour. The trader then goes to an actual generator who buys that contract to deliver electricity. The supplier, the buyer, still has to pay the £100 per megawatt hour it agreed, but the going rate for electricity is now £75 per megawatt hour. In this case, the generator pays the non-physical trader the difference, the £25 per megawatt hour, which is the trader's profit. Again, the trader needs to find a generator to buy this contract before the time of delivery. Otherwise, they're obliged to generate the power that they agreed to or face penalties if they're unable to. Just to be clear, these are massively oversimplified scenarios. Non-physical trading is usually far more complex than this. You might get true non-physical traders who basically buy and sell contracts without ever planning to deliver or purchase any electricity, and this puts the trader at significant risk. They could be forced to buy or sell those contracts at a loss if prices were to change in the opposite direction that they expected them to. Alternatively, they could face penalties for not delivering on their contracts. However, you can also find asset-backed non-physical traders. These are generators who have the ability to deliver on their contracts, but may enter into non-physical trades when an opportunity for profit arises. Due to the ability to actually generate the power necessary, this comes with less risk. Anyway, now you know how over-the-counter forward trading works, you know the timings of the intraday, and you know what non-physical trading means. It's time for us to have a look at another aspect of the wholesale market, exchange trading. I'll see you on the next episode. Yo, what's up? It's Neil again, and welcome back to the Energy Academy. In the last few episodes, we looked in detail at forward and futures trading, where electricity is traded for a specified price in advance of delivery. But advanced forecasts are never completely accurate, so suppliers have to fine-tune their predictions. The industry term for this is adding shape. Suppliers add shape to meet more dynamic, up-to-date forecasts of their customers' demand. This is where the spot market comes in. The spot market is for day ahead and intraday trading. It's called the spot market because it's for on-the-spot trading for the here and now. And day ahead, yep, you guessed it, day ahead trading just means that electricity is bought and sold for delivery the following day. Intraday trading, sometimes called within-day trading, is electricity that's bought and sold for delivery on that day. So let's set out a timeline. Imagine you're an electricity supplier. You forecasted your customers' demand for electricity over a number of months or even years. You've then utilised the forward or futures market to cover your base load, the minimum demand that your customers require across a full day. You've then purchased a peak product, also in a forward or futures trade, to cover your minimum customer demand at peak times. But now you're a day out from delivery and you're short of your updated forecasts. This is normal. You only purchase enough electricity needed to cover forecasts of minimum demand. This is so you don't overbuy in advance. But delivery's almost here, you're still short, and so you need to add shape. So you dip into the day ahead market to purchase the extra capacity that you need. But how does that work? Well, while power traders may engage in day ahead over-the-counter trades, generators and suppliers are more likely to use power exchanges. But what are power exchanges? Put simply, they're trading platforms for registered members. Based on the order book, the volumes that participants need to buy or sell, and the prices that they're willing to buy or sell at, power exchanges calculate a market price. Because of this, they're the most reliable prices available for electricity in short-term delivery. So you head to a day-ahead power exchange. The most common ones in Great Britain are Nord Pool and Epex Spot. You offer to buy the electricity you'll need to meet your customers' demands the following day on an hourly or half-hourly basis at the price that the market has decided for each period. In turn, a generator will then produce the electricity to meet your needs and be paid that same price. Intraday trading, on what's sometimes called the intraday continuous market, runs up until gate closure. Do you remember that term from a previous episode? It just means 1 hour before the beginning of the settlement period in which you're due to deliver. If you need to make any further adjustments to ensure that you can meet your customers' demands, now's the time to do it. Again, by using exchanges like Nord Pool or Epex Spot, you can agree to purchase electricity at the spot price, right up until gate closure. These two exchanges operate half-hourly auctions in order to facilitate this. And then you've done it. You've matched your customers' forecast demand with the amount of power that you've purchased from generators. Now there's 1 hour to go. 1 hour before the agreed delivery period, the market closes. Do you remember that term, gate closure? Generators and suppliers must publish details of their intended generation or demand for each settlement period. Sometimes they'll do this way in advance of gate closure, and sometimes they'll do it at the last minute. Each time you provide these details, it's called a physical notification. You can update your physical notification for any settlement period right up until gate closure. At gate closure, the most recent physical notifications are locked in for generators and suppliers. These locked-in details are called final physical notifications. Final physical notifications allow National Grid to forecast generation and demand nationally. This gives them a forward plan of projected imbalance levels. While these hour-ahead generation and supply levels are likely to be pretty close, they're never going to be bang on. So National Grid ESO still needs to balance any discrepancies between supply and demand. And this is where the balancing mechanism comes in. But what even is the balancing mechanism? Well, in the next episode, I'll explain exactly that. I'll see you there. Hi, I'm Neil Weaver, and in this episode of the Energy Academy, I'll be explaining how the balancing mechanism works. To begin, it's worth bearing in mind that the power system in Great Britain is always out of balance. This just means that supply and demand are never completely aligned. There are many reasons for this. Power stations may become unexpectedly unavailable, the wind may blow less than was forecasted, the nation could all turn on their tellies in response to a major breaking news story. And generators and suppliers could fail to meet the promises made in their final physical notifications. The possibilities are endless. Also, as our system increasingly relies on intermittent renewable technologies like wind and solar, the system's more prone to being out of balance. Because of this, National Grid ESO puts provisions in place to make sure the system is always balanced enough to prevent a blackout and to keep frequency at around 50 Hz. Established in 2001 alongside the Balancing and Settlement Code, the balancing mechanism is the system that the ESO uses to balance the system in real time. Small adjustments made on top of the wider power market can be made through the balancing mechanism so that the ESO can keep the lights on. Participants can register assets known as Balancing Mechanism Units or BMUs with Elexon, the organisation responsible for managing the Balancing and Settlement Code. The Balancing and Settlement Code is essentially just a massive document that outlines all the rules and regulations of the balancing mechanism. It basically tells participants what they can and can't do. Essentially, when necessary, the ESO decides to take balancing actions by paying participants to flex up or flex down. Registered BMUs must submit a bid and an offer price for each half-hour settlement period by gate closure. The bid price is for flexing down. It's the price at which a generator is prepared to reduce its generation or a supplier is prepared to increase its demand. The offer price is for flexing up. It's the price at which a generator is prepared to increase its generation or a supplier is prepared to reduce its demand. A BMU's bid price and offer price for the same settlement period are almost always different. As I mentioned before, all generators and suppliers, not just BMUs, must confirm their planned generation or demand levels 1 hour before delivery at gate closure. BMUs additionally submit their bid and offer prices for the balancing mechanism to be turned up or turned down. Once National Grid ESO has all this information, and between gate closure and the end of the settlement period, they decide which bids and offers to accept in order to balance the system. Most of the time, participants pay to flex down, but they can also bid negative amounts. If accepted, this means the ESO pays participants to deploy BMUs to decrease generation or increase demand. If the ESO accepts a bid or offer price from a BMU, it issues a bid offer acceptance, or BOA. The BMU must then flex up or flex down as required to balance the system. Sometimes generators don't deliver in line with their final physical notifications and bid offer acceptances. In this case, Elexon needs to make up for any shortfall caused by non-delivery, and this costs them. To recover that cost, participants who were out of position, meaning that they did not match their contracted and physical delivery, must pay Elexon. Out of position participants are charged at the system price. This is a price determined by Elexon for each settlement period in a process known as cash out. While being charged the system price is often considered a penalty, there is still an opportunity for participants to generate revenues when this happens. This is known as NIV chasing, and I'll be explaining exactly how that works in the next episode. I'll see you there. Alright crew, Neil again, bringing you another episode of the Energy Academy. So now you know how the balancing mechanism works, let's explore what happens when participants are out of position. A generator or supplier is out of position in a settlement period when it doesn't deliver in line with its final physical notification or its bid offer acceptance. Imbalance pricing, also known as cash out or the system price, is the amount they are charged by Elexon as a penalty for being out of balance. A quick reminder, Elexon is the organisation in charge of administering the balancing and settlement code. Anyway, imbalance pricing is a key part of wholesale trading arrangements in Great Britain. The wholesale market is set up so that suppliers enter into contracts with generators to make sure that generation and demand are aligned. That said, these contracts don't always cover the generation and demand requirements on the transmission system. So, in order to balance the system, National Grid ESO takes actions in the balancing mechanism. This much you know already. The system price, the amount charged by Elexon for being out of position, is charged per megawatt hour. If a participant has generated less power or used more power than it said it would in its physical notification, it has to buy that shortfall of electricity at the system price. If a participant has generated more power or used less power than it said it would, it has to sell that extra electricity at the system price. The system price just reflects the cost that the ESO incurs to balance the system. This is where system length comes in. When people talk about system length, it's just a way of visualizing imbalance. When generation is greater than demand, basically when there's too much electricity on the system is long. In this case, the system price is based on how much it costs the ESO to reduce generation or increase demand. When demand is greater than generation, when there's not enough electricity on the system is short. Here, the system price is based on how much it costs the ESO to increase generation or reduce demand. So, is being charged the system price a penalty? Yes, but also no. While it could be considered a punishment for your asset being out of step with what you said it would do, there's still an opportunity for revenues here. This is widely known as NIV chasing. This happens when operators run their assets to get exposure to the system price. It's called NIV chasing because overall imbalance is known as the net imbalance volume, or NIV, and participants chase it. They do this by betting on what the system price will be and then deliberately over-generating or under-generating so that those additional volumes are then charged at the system price. This could be better or worse than what they achieved on the wholesale market. Though it can, in theory, be a risky trading strategy, it does open the door to another revenue stream for asset operators. Anyway, in the next episode, I'll introduce you to ancillary services. I'll see you there. Neil again, bringing you the latest chapter of this Energy Academy series outlining Great Britain's electricity markets. So I've covered all the major markets for the trade of electricity in Great Britain, but there's still a group of services through which generators in Great Britain can earn money. Ancillary services. As you're probably sick of hearing by now, the supply and demand of electricity have to be balanced at all times. On top of this, there are other elements such as frequency and voltage that have to be regulated and carefully managed. This is so that the massive amount of electricity being transmitted across the country is able to be used safely in homes and businesses. National Grid ESO relies on what it calls ancillary services to enable the system to operate in a stable, efficient and safe way. There are several different types of ancillary services here in Great Britain, and I'm going to outline some of the main ones here. These are going to be very high-level introductions to these services, and I'll come back to some of them in more detail in future series. First up, frequency response. All electricity on the network must run with a target frequency of around 50 Hz. If frequency changes by more than 1%, so outside of that 49.5 Hz to 50.5 Hz, it runs the risk of damaging equipment or causing blackouts. Frequency response services increase or decrease the amount of power on the network on a second-by-second basis to maintain these frequency levels. Therefore, frequency response is suited to faster ramping assets. Basically, technologies that can power up extremely quickly, like batteries, which we love here at Modo. Next up, reactive power services. When we talk about power, we're usually referring to active or true power, the one measured in watts that powers your light bulb. Reactive power is a sort of unused power. It kind of sloshes around as a result of electricity being transferred from one place to another, and it's measured in something called mVars. You might have heard the analogy that refers to reactive power as the frothy head on active power's pint of beer. It doesn't technically do anything, it's just a byproduct of AC circuits. However, despite this, reactive power still has to be managed by being topped up or absorbed at certain times in certain parts of the country. Third, let's look at voltage management. Back in series 1, I described voltage as the pressure which pushes electricity through cables. Well, voltage has a close relationship with reactive power too. So, when reactive power is added to or absorbed from the grid, voltage has to be increased or decreased as well. Great Britain's electricity system runs at fixed voltages depending on which part of the system you're looking at. These are 400, 275 or 132 kilovolts respectively. Voltage must remain within 5% of these levels to maintain grid stability. Fourth up, let's look at inertia services. Inertia simply means a tendency to remain unchanged. Electricity system inertia is traditionally produced by the turbines in old school power stations, but crucially not wind turbines. You see, these keep spinning for a while even after they lose power, and this basically creates a sort of bumper system that prevents an immediate change in frequency. However, with the move away from traditional gas and coal-fired power stations towards renewables, National Grid ESO needs to procure inertia from elsewhere. This is just to make sure that frequency on the grid doesn't change too quickly. Number 5 is reserve services, and this one's pretty simple. Reserve services basically ensure that there's enough reserve power on the grid in case there's a sudden change in generation or demand levels. These don't need to be quite as fast acting as frequency response, but they still need to be called upon at very short notice. And lastly, restoration, aka the service formerly known as Black Start. In the event of a total grid shutdown, restoration provides the ability to start a power station without external grid electricity. From there, the rest of the grid is re-energized, essentially bringing the whole country back online. So, now you know why ancillary services exist and the problems that they solve. But how do participants in ancillary services actually make money? Well, generally through tenders. Some of the more established ancillary services have tenders that run at regular intervals. Some of those are years apart and some of them are day ahead, every day. Newer, more experimental ancillary services might run tenders or auctions to kind of figure out the feasibility of those services. The requirements of each service very much determine which technology types are able or encouraged to participate. For example, fast-acting frequency response services like dynamic containment are particularly suited to batteries because of the sub-second response times needed. In general, ancillary services tend to be dominated by flexible, dispatchable technologies. These include batteries, demand-side response, reciprocating engines, open-cycle gas turbines, and pumped hydro, among others. For generators, ancillary services can provide an extra source of revenue, or sometimes even their main source of revenue. They earn money by providing their excess generation capacity to the grid. Demand-side response providers can also benefit by reducing their consumption at times of high demand. Essentially, they earn money by selling this reduced capacity back to the grid. Overall, ancillary services play a crucial role in maintaining the stability and reliability of the grid in Great Britain. The participation of various businesses in these services helps to ensure that the grid is able to meet the needs of consumers. Anyway, that's all I'm going to cover on ancillary services and the electricity market in Great Britain in general. Congrats guys, you've made it to the end of the course. If your head is still spinning from all the new information, you may want to stay tuned for the final episode. I'll wrap up all the key points I've covered across the course so far. I'll see you there. Hi guys, Neil Weaver again, and you've reached the end of another series of the Energy Academy. In this episode, I'll recap everything I've covered in this course. The electricity market in Great Britain is not a simple single entity, but rather a series of interdependent markets and mechanisms. The balancing of supply and demand is overseen by National Grid ESO, and the independent regulator is Ofgem. The capacity market is basically there to make sure the lights stay on at times of severe system stress. Because generator projects usually require capacity market contracts to be feasible, the capacity market basically determines how much and what type of new generation gets built and what stays on the system. Once generators are up and running, the electricity they produce is traded, and this usually happens on the wholesale market. The wholesale market can be split up roughly into two categories. The first is forward and futures markets, buying and selling electricity in advance. And second, spot markets, which are then further split into day ahead and intraday. Electricity can be traded directly between two parties, known as over-the-counter trading, or on exchanges. Electricity is normally traded in fairly standard time periods, which are named in reference to the ether day and ether blocks, those 4-hour chunks. Some important trading products to remember include baseload, which runs through all ether blocks 24 hours a day with the same volume of electricity traded the whole time, and peak products, which runs from ether blocks 3, 4 and 5 on weekdays. Electricity can be traded physically. This is when a generator sells electricity and electrons travel across cables to physically deliver it. Electricity can also be traded non-physically. This is where businesses essentially bet on the price of electricity changing in the future. An hour before electricity is due to be delivered, gate closure occurs. At this point, all market participants must announce their final physical notifications. This is so National Grid ESO has a view of planned generation and demand levels. From there, the ESO has to take actions to balance forecasted supply with demand, and the way it does this is through the balancing mechanism. This is the market the ESO uses to tell participants to turn generation up or down depending on need. Participants who are out of position, i.e. they don't do what they said they would, and then subject to what's called the system price. The system price simply reflects the cost that the ESO has to pay to balance the system. Sometimes participants deliberately submit a final physical notification that will leave them out of balance. This is so they're exposed to paying or being paid the system price where they think it will be profitable for them. This is a practice known as NIV chasing. The other way that National Grid ESO balances the system is through its ancillary services. These allow it to manage grid frequency, voltage, to turn to reserve power if necessary, and loads of other things. And that's it. Now you know how the electricity market in Great Britain works. Thanks for watching this series of the Energy Academy. Anyway, I've been Neil Weaver, and I'll see you next time.